Hi, I'm Andy. Welcome to Really Random Reads. Today I'm going to talk to you about a biography of Patricia Highsmith written by this bloke, Andrew Wilson. Came out in the early 2000s, and I always begin these, as I say, when I can remember, by talking about how I came across the book. Came across this one because I've read a number of Patricia Highsmith's stories, really liked her as a writer, and one day I picked up this biography of her, which is much shorter. It's got a brilliant title, comes from one of her letters. It's called Devils, Lusts and Strange Desires. It was written by Richard Bradford. I took this home and I read it, and whilst it gave a brilliant, quick oversight of Highsmith as a writer, I kind of didn't like it in a way because I found the author to be a bit prudish and judgmental, particularly about Highsmith and her sex life, in ways that I couldn't see what was so shocking, to be honest. So I was kind of interested to read another biography about her, and I went for this one, which is thicker, more detailed, but still extremely readable. And it's called, I should have said, Beautiful Shadow, which I thought was a nice title. Beautiful Shadow, A Life of Patricia Highsmith. Patricia Highsmith's books, very well known. She wrote the Ripley series, so The Talented Mr. Ripley is one of the first books in that series. If you haven't read any of her books, be hard, I think, not to have at least heard of some of the film adaptations. So for me, sort of my lifetime, it was a big deal when I've forgotten his name, the one that came out in the 90s, I put his name on the screen, came out, the film adaptation of that. But she's also known for stories like Strangers on a Train, made into a film by Alfred Hitchcock, and Carol, which is a romantic story about a romance between two women. And I don't want to give a spoiler away about it, but let me just say it's one of her more optimistic novels, one of her more optimistic stories, and certainly for the time that was written, in terms of it being about a same-sex relationship, that weren't that common. So, and it was made into a movie recently. It looks like a sticker. It's not actually. They've put it in the cover. I hate that when film stuff ends up on books. Not that I don't like films. I don't know, it just feels wrong. I want to peel it off. Except it doesn't. It's part of the cover. But if you haven't checked it out, I haven't seen it myself, but this is a very well-regarded film. What I can say, though, is the book is brilliant, so have a read of that as well. Now, why would you pick up a biography of Patricia Highsmith as a writer? Why would you actually be interested in her? This is a brilliant book if you are interested in the act of writing. It has lots of Highsmith's kind of philosophy about writing, but also, it has lots of practical stuff as well, sort of practical advice and guidance. I'll come on to that in a bit. Other reasons for picking it up might be human interest, might be you're just interested in her stories. So this kind of begs the question of why would you be interested in her stories? There is a brilliant quote from one of her readers at the beginning of this book. I'll read it to you. I wrote it down, I liked it so much. To me, the experience of reading my first Highsmith book was a physical experience of being confronted with evil. I put it away. I felt tangible evil coming off the page. Now, depending on your reading tastes, that sort of might get your juices flowing for reading Highsmith, or you might be like, don't know, that's not my cup of tea. But I definitely fall into the first camp. What's interesting about her is that she kind of has her foot in two camps, I guess. She wrote genre fiction, perhaps most accurately described as suspense fiction, but you could see a lot of horror in her books. You could see a lot of element of the thriller, but also, for me and a lot of other people, a bit like John le Carré or something like that. That term literary fiction, it causes a lot of problems. But there is something, if you watch Criminoli's channel, and he really likes Patricia Highsmith, by the way, but he will talk about books that he refers to as trash. And he has no issue saying that. He doesn't feel that it's an insult to call a book trash. Pulp fiction is maybe the term that's more historically been used. He's got no qualms with that, and nor should he. Fiction written for entertainment's sake, that's maybe intended to be a little bit disposable, that's not intended to be sort of poured over endlessly like a Joyce or something. She kind of has her foot in both camps with this type of stuff, and that's why it's so interesting. Her work transcends, oh, that sounds so pretentious, but it kind of transcends genre in many ways, because, you know, good writing is good writing, essentially. But first and foremost, what she puts right at the front is writing must entertain, and she has no quibbles about that, no qualms about that, and she keeps coming back to that throughout her career. Something else about Patricia Highsmith kind of touched on sexuality. So I guess we would today say she was a queer writer, and it's really interesting to kind of read this. Remember, this is somebody who kind of came up, I mean, her life goes across many periods, but kind of came up in my mind in the 50s, time we associate with conformity, a time when homosexuality was seen as a mental illness. There's a really great quote in here. I think I wrote it down, made a note of it, because it's also just gets you a flavour of her gifted description, which, you know, you kind of expect a novelist to have. But she writes of kissing a boy, it felt like falling into a bucket of oysters. Or rather, it's like falling into a bucket of oysters, isn't it? And all through her life, you see these pressures of what's expected of her, and she goes the other way in many instances, and sometimes in a way that's not commendable. So, for example, at one point, and she's a challenging person to read about, at one point, she essentially leaves somebody, a romantic partner, to die, and goes off and kind of has a night out. And you can see similarities between Highsmith and many of her sort of dark, troubling protagonists in reading this biography of her. I'm glancing down because there was something else I wanted to say with that, and I'm jogging my mind. And that thing was, if you're thinking about modern society, so there's a gender debate sort of going on at the moment, and I find it difficult to read books without that in mind. And what's interesting, or I found interesting, was when I looked back at this biography, which was written about 20 years ago, of Highsmith, and when, you know, Highsmith, she was 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, so that's the past as well. She's struggling quite explicitly with gender issues in this biography, and you can see, you know, she explicitly says she identifies as a male person in a female person's body. And if this biography had been written today, I think it would have got much more into that than it did having been written 20 years ago. But you can still see kind of like primary sources, I guess, there, where there is material maybe for a biographer to go back and say, okay, so we know Highsmith's sexuality kind of informed a lot of her writing. How did her gender identity inform a lot of her writing? That kind of, it's alluded to in the biography, and we're exposed to some of the primary sources about it, but it isn't explicitly addressed head on, and it'd be interesting to see what future Highsmith biographers do with that. When she's writing these stories, unashamedly, she says entertainment comes first. That, you have to have that. That's the most important thing. The primary thing, I think, is the word she uses. But it's not kind of, and I hate saying this, I sound like I'm running it down. It's not cheap Pulp Fiction. There's more going on there. When she talks about having written the Ripley books, this actually comes in terms of the first Ripley book, The Talented Mr. Ripley. She wrote, I often had the feeling Ripley was writing it and I merely typing. When she writes in her notebook about the novel Carol, her romance story with two women falling for each other, I live so completely with them now, I don't think I can contemplate an amour, as in a person to have a relationship with herself. She's living, she lives these books, she's not just knocking them out for a deadline. Other things about Patricia Highsmith as a writer that I found interesting. and this is now we're getting into the more, if you're interested in writers, okay? If you're interested in the act of writing. So she deliberately avoided when she was a young person, and remember the time as well, she avoided learning anything practical. So she had the opportunity to learn to be a typist. She chose not to do that because she wanted to remove the opportunity of being trapped in a job as a typist. She wanted to dedicate herself to writing. One of her philosophies of writing was that it needs to be intuitive. You want to not consciously think about what you're doing. Let me explain that a little bit better. So she liked to write at night, not because some writers are quite pretentious about this, right? Particularly, I'm thinking about like the beat writers here and stuff. Not because of some kind of like vain reason, but because she felt that that was when her intuition was at her best, because her conscious brain was the most shut off, because she was a bit tired. So when she was writing, she didn't have the conscious voice kind of holding her back from stuff. She was in more of a flow state. That's my hippy-dippy terminology. It's explained better in the book. Other things to share with you about this. So she talks about writing out of a darkness within herself. That's how she created. That's how so many of her characters are so dark, but they also come across as honest depictions. It's not sitting down trying to write a supervillain for supervillain's sake. Write events, not character motivations. She felt extremely passionate about that. Damn it, I've lost the bookmark page. But basically what she was saying, and she took this from Dostoevsky, was she really connected with a passage in one of Dostoevsky's diaries where he was saying, don't get so hung up on trying to write about what's motivating a character. They probably don't even know what's motivating themselves, as in life, how much do we really, really know what's motivating us, and how much is a narrative that we feed ourselves. Instead, just tell the events that are unfolding. That is largely a reason that I find a lot of postmodern fiction boring, because you'll get pages and pages and pages of the opposite. You'll get pages and pages and pages about speculating motive. The biographer is quite funny because he says he's going to take that advice and not fall into the trap of trying to read Highsmith's mind. Instead, he's going to try as best as he can to paint what happened and let the events speak for themselves. Other things about writing to share with you. So she has this philosophy, as I say, about intuition, the subconscious, trying to get out of the way of the writing and letting it flow. She would write for 3 to 4 hours, and then she would take breaks doing manual tasks where she would kind of switch part of her brain off, washing the dishes, doing ironing, doing laundry, and then she would find she would make creative leaps while she was doing those, I suppose, kind of meditative activities. Thought that was very interesting. Resonated a lot with me. Also interested now because, if I'm doing something like what she was describing, if I'm taking a break from something, I'll often kind of like whack a podcast on or something like that. Don't have so many of these kind of spaces just to let the brain think, and might be doing myself a bit of a disservice there. Was interested. This is a writer who in many ways found success early. Hitchcock bought one of her rights to one of her novels, ran off and made one of her films. It became a great success. What surprised me was she had a great deal of failure as a writer, even at the very beginning. And she talks about that. And Highsmith is often perceived as a very, and look towards the end, she was, I think, very negative sort of personality. But she talks, you see all these failures she faced. She talks a lot about optimism, and she talks about, as a writer, needing to have failures and meet them with, maybe you wouldn't associate these words coming from Highsmith, enthusiasm, courage, optimism, these types of things. So if you are, I've seen several book channels where people are trying to sort of get published and things like that. If you're trying to have success with writing, if you're trying to be a published writer, you can find a lot of optimism in these in these biographies about Highsmith that maybe you would not expect to find. whilst this would be my recommendation of the Highsmith biography, if you were only going to read one, I do think that towards the end, the biographer, I want to say, lets her off a bit lightly. By the end, and I'm just going to say this, Highsmith wasn't a very nice person, okay? So, for many reasons that kind of unfold throughout this book, some of them I think to do with the pressures of her time, growing up in an age of great conformity, having to battle with that. There's an absolutely brilliant quote that she wrote about her mum. Even if it takes me a minute to find it, let me read it to you. Some of the pressures that she faced, okay? My mother is the type who fires a shotgun and then wonders why some of the birds are killed, others wounded, and the rest scared. Then she asks, why don't the birds come back? So she had a lot of pressures and stuff going on, but also, maybe for separate reasons, she kind of just wasn't very nice. And it talks a bit about how if you see pictures of Highsmith and stuff, she's often with a cat. And she has this public image of being nice with animals and things. But as one of her ex-partners said, God help me, I wouldn't want to come back as her cat. Sometimes the things that she used to do to it. And also, there's this joke about, it's kind of a joke about her relationship with snails. So she's seen as this sort of having this affection for snails to the extent of turning up at a party with snails in her handbag. But really there's an exhibitionism in a lot of this, if not all of it. There's a kind of a cultivating of an image. Minor interruption there, but I'd kind of made my point anyway. So we're at the end of Highsmith's life, and as I say, it doesn't end well. And thinking about a couple of the reasons for that, one, I can't do, I think, this review, or this discussion, let's say, without mentioning, is Highsmith's drinking alcohol. It's pretty much a character in the book as much as any of the living, breathing characters are characters in the book. And you see over the course of her life, her relationship with alcohol change. If you've ever smoked, or if you smoke, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you might be watching something on TV, a film, say a TV program, a drama, and characters will be smoking on screen, and it really makes you want to smoke. This book is like the opposite for that in terms of alcohol and I was going to say fags, but so cigarettes if you're watching this abroad, okay? You leave it just almost feeling physically like, and you can see the effect that Highsmith's drinking had on her over the course of her life. So one of the factors I think in why her situation ended up as negatively as it did, it would be difficult to overlook her drinking as part of that, and that comes through really clearly in the book. The other thing, and maybe this kind of spawns discussions in its own right, is Highsmith had this view, as have other authors that the book references, other schools of thought, that if you are happy and content in your life, you don't write well. And there's instances in the book where I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say you can see her sabotaging things for herself in order to, I do want to say improve her writing. I think it was to that extent, consciously to that extent. That's a really interesting sort of theory, I think, and not one that I adhere to. So, slight side note, but my friend sort of looked a lot at creativity and innovation, and one of the things that she learned from doing that was that people are at their most productive when they feel safe and they feel able to play. Even adults, I'm talking here. So they feel safe, they have security, they feel able to play, and they feel able to make mistakes with things. And for that reason, if you have a working environment where there's bullying and things going on, those don't tend to be very creative places. And I think that's interesting to kind of challenge, I know in a roundabout way, but to kind of challenge this misperception that sounds, I feel uncomfortable saying this because Highsmith was such a successful writer. I haven't written anything, but this misperception that people can have of like, oh, I need to be miserable to create great art. And you can see many instances in this book where you feel like Highsmith is really putting herself through the ringer of suffering to kind of be the artist or be the writer, you know. So concluding thoughts, I think I just want to drum home that point again around this is an interesting one to pick up if you're interested in the kind of push and pull between entertainment versus literary fiction. Let's just use that shorthand. And you've got your writers like Graham Greene, who are pretty much like, boom, this is my books that are entertainment, these are my lighter books, and bang, these are my books that are more literary. I mean them to be more sort of deeply understood. And then you have people pick up one of his entertainment ones and say, well, I got more from this than I got from one of his so-called literary ones. If you're interested in that whole type of thing, then this Highsmith biography is great for that, as it is for so many other kind of literary topics in there, and just kind of like watching the meteoric rise of a person. And then I'm going to say tragic, like their tragic decline and fall. Thank you for staying with me through this somewhat rambling video, and I hope I've done something to encourage you to pick up a Highsmith book if you never have. Otherwise, thanks for staying with this overly long video. Bye.